Outside of this building, I never tell people that I'm a rabbi. When I'm sitting on an airplane, when I'm on vacation on a cruise boat, when I'm on a bus, when I'm anywhere in public, if somebody says, "What do you do for a living?" either I change the subject, or I'll tell them that I'm a college teacher, which is actually partially true, or I tell them that I write the questions for Jeopardy. Once on a cruise boat, I told somebody with a straight face that I'm a pornographer. That got a response. But I never tell them I'm a rabbi, because I'll tell you what happens. Once I forgot myself. I was sitting on an airplane. I was very tired. The guy turned to me, lovely young man. He said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm a rabbi." Oh. He said, "You know, when my wife and I have a problem, we pray on it, and God always answers our problems. Do you do that?" And I thought for a minute. I said, "You know, that's an interesting thing. I pray on it, and God always answers my problems." And I said to him, "I have to tell you the truth, I don't. I usually ask my wife what to do, and I pray that she doesn't kill me when I ask her." That's not the way that God works for us. He said, "Really? That's not the way? I thought you Jews were very close to God. You're God's chosen people." I said, "Yeah, but it just works differently for us. We have a different relationship. We have a different kind of God." "Really? What kind of God do you have?" That's why I never tell people I'm a rabbi on an airplane. It's a really interesting question. I mean, like most people, I was raised as a little kid. I believed in God. And somewhere around my 13th birthday, just around my bar mitzvah, I stopped believing in God, because puberty and modernity and realism and all the other things sort of ganged up on me, and it sort of left me. Partly it was because I grew up at a time, and many of you did as well, when rabbis never talked about this. You came to synagogue, you opened the prayer book, you recited Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, but my rabbi never spoke about God. He never talked about what it means to believe in God, who is God, how does one know that God is there. He never used the phrase, we talked to God, and God gave us the answer. We prayed on it, and God gave us the answer. My rabbi never talked about God. He talked about Jewish education. He talked about the Jewish people. He talked about Israel. He talked about intermarriage. He talked about the Jewish future. He never talked about God. When I went into rabbinical school, I went to see him because I loved him very much. He's a wonderfully wise and deep and loyal rabbi, a great rabbi, very traditional rabbi. In his private life, we knew that he was very traditional. And I sat with him because I was this, rowdy 22-year-old, and I said to him, "Why didn't you ever talk to us about God? I don't remember you ever talking about what it means to believe in God, who is God." And his eyes actually began to fill with tears. And he said, "Because it was impossible. After the Holocaust, it was impossible to talk about God. It's simply impossible to say anything affirmative about God." And so in my upbringing, the God question, do you believe in God? Is God close to you? What is the nature of God? Who is this God? That was never answered by my religious education. In seminary, we never answered that question. In seminary, we answered the question academically. I could tell you, and you'll see in a minute, I can tell you who Maimonides' God was. I can tell you who Mordechai Kaplan's God was. I can tell you the God of any particular text. But no one ever asked me in seminary, do you have a relationship with God? Do you know God? That was never a question in my seminary education. What's happened remarkably over the last generation is that sense of distance from God has dissipated now. And people are once again asking this question, what does it mean to believe in God? Who is this God you believe in? How do you know there's a God in the world? If we face moments when the world becomes uninhabitable, moments of suffering, moments of loss, moments of Holocaust, moments of profound evil, where is your God then? Where is your God then? And what difference does it make to a human being to believe in God? These questions are, once again, real questions. Real questions for the Jewish community, real questions for the culture at large. America is a very religious culture. That is, more people profess religion than in almost any other modern industrialized country in the world. But when you ask the question, well, what difference does it make in their conduct, in the way that relate to other people, in the way that they vote, the way that they spend their money, the way that they drive, the way that they act in the world? That's a more difficult question to ask. But now that question is being asked in a very real way, both in the Jewish community and beyond. So Rabbi Farkas and I decided that this year we would devote our series to that question. The God I know. And we would explore God. So I'm going to ask you to do two things. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to listen to a whole long list of speakers. We have some wonderful people coming to talk to us. And we've asked each of them to take an hour, 1 hour, and to tell us about the God they worship, the God they believe in, the God they know. And then in the second hour, one of us, together with all of you, we're going to get to interrogate them. And we're going to ask them these questions. Who is this God that you know? What is the nature of this God? How does this God interact with us? Where is your God at moments of loss and suffering? And what difference does it make to believe in God? Why should anyone believe in God? I want you to ask those questions to each of our speakers and to see if together we can form a clearer idea of what this means to believe in God. Here's the second thing I'm going to ask you to do. It's a lot more threatening. I want you to ask yourself the same questions. And if you have the time, and if you have the inclination, I want you to write something down. There's a series that was created. It was a radio show that was begun in the 50s by Edward R. Murrow that returned to NPR some years ago called This I Believe. And it was everyone was given, I think, about 1,000 words. It's less than a 10-minute kind of thing, where they talked about, this is my faith, this is my theology, my belief in God. I'd like you to try to write one of those for yourself. I'd like you to try to write your own personal theology of the God you believe in. And if you're not sure, or if you're conflicted, or if you find, as I did when I was young, that I had more questions than answers, write that down also. In other words, if you can't say, this is the God I believe in, ask yourself why not? And if you could meet the God you believed in, what questions would you want to ask her? That's the question. What would you want to say to that God? And see if you can get that down into some paper. And anyone who would like to share that can mail it to me, to email it to me, or mail it to me. I won't share it. It'll be private. But it'll be very interesting to sort of gather the faith statements of members of our community. That's going to be our project together. Over the course of the year, from now until February, which is our 15-week year, we're going to take a look at some of the deep sources. We're going to talk about the God of the Bible. We're going to talk about the God of the modern philosophers. Rabbi Farkas is going to talk about the God of his teacher, Neil Gilman. And I'm going to get to talk about the God of my teacher, Harold Schulweis. We're going to welcome Bradley Artson, who's going to talk about something called process theology. God not as a thing, but as a process. We're going to welcome Rabbi Mark Borowitz, who works at Beit Tshuva, who's going to talk about what God belief means when you're helping someone fight heroin addiction and alcoholism. We're going to welcome rabbis, Yoshi Zweibach, who's the new rabbi at Stephen Weiss Temple, and the first woman Orthodox rabbi in Los Angeles, Rabbanit Thomas Newborn, who works at B'nai David Judea, will be coming to talk to us about her vision of God. We're going to welcome Reb Mimi Feigelson, who is a mystic and a Hasidic scholar, about the God she worships. Last year, I promised you that we were going to have a Shabbaton. So our Shabbaton this year is going to be the last weekend in January. And our guest is going to be Professor Arthur Green, who is the head of the Boston Hebrew College Rabbinical School and one of the most profound philosophers of God in the culture now. And he'll be our guest for the entire weekend. And as well, we're going to reach outside of the Jewish community, and we're going to welcome Reverend Mark Whitlock, who is leader of an African-American Christian church in Irvine, a brilliant, brilliant scholar, and talk about the God he worships. And we're going to welcome Imam Jihad Turk, who runs who is the leader of the seminary at Claremont University, as well as the leader of the Los Angeles Islamic Center, about the God that he worships, so that we can get a rounded view of various ways that human beings in our culture relate to God. And all of you will get to ask them all of these great questions. Now, we tried to invite God himself or herself, and so far we haven't heard the answer to the email. But if it comes, you'll be the first to know. Tonight, we'd like to begin by talking about the ways that Jews talk about God. And what we're going to present to you tonight is a sort of variety show. Because it turns out that while we might say that God is one, Jews have looked at God in very different ways over the course of Jewish history. Rabbi Farkas is going to talk about God in the Bible, and then the God of the rabbis. Then we'll take a short break. And when we come back, I'm going to talk about the God of the philosophers and the God of the mystics, and show you 4 different ways that Jews over the course of our generations have thought about and imagined God. Rabbi Farkas.
I'm in charge? Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you. Does everybody have the packet? It begins with the God of old. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. It's very hard to speak about the God of the Bible with a sense of this, put this God in a box and say this is all that God is in the Bible, especially in our community. We understand God in many different ways, and we think about God and we talk about God of the Bible through its own historical context. And we know that the Bible was written over many thousands of years in Jewish communities from all over the world. So to give a unified understanding about what God is of the Bible, very challenging. So I want to offer you a snapshot, a Polaroid snapshot of one version of the God of the Bible that I think resonates as what we understand of what God might mean. And it's found right there at the moment where God meets the people at Mount Sinai. So if you take a look at the paper with me. Exodus chapter 19. In the 3rd month, when the people of Israel were gone forth from the land of Egypt, the same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. And for they departed from Rephidim and had come to the desert of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. And there Israel camped before the mount. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, Tell the people of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So first of all, here they are in the desert, and they've come to a mountain. The God in the Bible is a God of the mountain. There are 4 major mountains in the Torah that are talked about where God is seen and God acts. Mount Sinai being the most important of those 4 mountains. In fact, later in the Tanakh, when Elijah is running around with against King Ahav, the Arameans call the Israelites the people of the mountain God, because they understood that we lived in the mountains and that our God was a God of the mountains. Elijah, again, climbed Mount Carmel when he was ready to relieve the plague of drought upon the people. He climbed Mount Carmel and had a contest of wills between him and the prophets of Baal, in which he tried to prove to the people that faith in our God, the God of Israel, indeed exists. And he won that showdown at the Carmel Corral, so to speak, with these other prophets, bringing faith back to the people. Our God is a God of a mountain, so it's natural that the place we would come to meet God in the Torah is on a mountain. So Mount Moriah is another one. I can go through and name them all. Mount Moriah, Mount Har Sinai, Mount of Moab, Mount Hor, where Aaron passed away. So those are just 4 of the mountains. There are other mountains, but those are the 4 the rabbis pick up on more than any other. So our God is a God of the mountain. Our God dwells on high. Mountains are perfect places for gods because they're imposing and scary, because they reach towards the heavens, because they breach out of the ground, because they break up a very flat desert landscape coming to a mountain makes sense. Mountains can be very useful that way. So what is the first thing that God tells this picture of God in the Bible tells Moses to tell the people? I did something for you and brought you to this place. Of course, that thing that God did for us is the Exodus from Egypt. There's a story that predates this one about the Exodus story. We all know it. We tell it on Passover. We read it every day in our Siddur. God's first act on the mountain is to tell Moshe, to tell the people, don't forget, I bore you here on eagle's wings. And you are my people because I did this thing for you. Begins a transactional relationship. God graced us by coming into the world and saving us from the land of Egypt and brought us to God's holy mountain. So that is the first strain when we think about who is this God of the Bible. So he says, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own treasure among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God asks the people and says, I have a proposition for you. If you keep my holy covenant, you will become a holy nation, a nation of priests. You'll be imbued with a special sense of kedusha, a sense of otherness, a sense of specialness, a responsibility in the world. And if you keep my covenant, this transactional relationship, then you will be treasured amongst all the peoples. Of course, what's the implication of that proposition? If you don't keep my commandment, what will happen? He doesn't say that here. Nobody gives you the bad news at the beginning of a relationship. Right? They're never going to tell you, don't read the fine print when you're trying, when you're going on a date. The first time you date someone, they're not going to necessarily tell you about, where they leave their socks in the bedroom when they get home. So God is saying, if you keep my covenant, and you'll become a treasured people. Who wouldn't want to be treasured by a God who just saved them out of the land of Egypt? It sounds like a really good proposition. So then it goes on to say, these are the words which you shall speak to the people of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all the Lord has spoken, we will do. They haven't even heard everything yet, and they said, sounds good to me. And Moses returned the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak to you and believe you forever. That's a wishful proposition. And Moses told the words of the people to the Lord, and it came pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings, a thick cloud upon the mount, the sound of the shofar exceedingly loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the bottom of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount trembled greatly. And when the voice of the shofar sounded long, it became louder and louder. Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon the Mount Sinai on the top of the mount. And the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, go down, charge the people, lest they break through the Lord's gates, and many of them perish. So what is the image? If I was filming this as a movie, how expensive of a budget would I need to create Mount Sinai of the book of Exodus? I've got smoke, I've got fire, I've got lightning, I've got this blaring shofar, I've got Moses running up and down the mountain over and over again. Very dramatic stuff, right? Very dramatic. It's like the Super Bowl of theologies. It's like seeing the Super Bowl halftime show. Just lights and explosions. It's like going to a Kiss concert. I don't know, maybe I'm aiming myself. It's like going to a Beatles concert. How old do I have to go here? It's like going to a Frank Sinatra concert with pyrotechnics. Why do you think the people needed that? This is the first question, right? I'm not going to answer these questions necessarily, but why do we need the big show? Why do we need the Super Bowl or the big concert? We just came through the splitting of the sea. And we just landed here at this mountain. Why do we need the big show? We've always been a cynical people, mind you. Don't forget what happens in 2 chapters later. Moses is up there, the 10 Commandments are given, all the people are in awe, and then 2 chapters later, Moses is hanging out with God on top of the mountain, and there seems to be some kind of party going on down at the bottom of the mountain. You go down the hill, and sure enough, there's a golden calf, right? I ask this question because it's kind of like this. If you're only as good as your last show, right? What happens when you have nothing new to show the people? No new circus, no new explosion, right? What happens when the next blockbuster movie, its special effects aren't as crazy as the one that came before it? People begin to... It's like when you go to your first Cirque du Soleil show, and you're like, wow, this is totally amazing. And then you go to your third Cirque du Soleil show, and you're like, I could do that. You couldn't do that, but you're basically like, oh, that's not that interesting anymore, have to keep spinning the colors and things in different ways, right? So that's the first thing we learn is that a charismatic God, one of the questions we ask is, why do we need the big show? Why do we need all of this miracle stuff for God to somehow draw our attention enough that we'll even listen to this transactional relationship and have a covenant? Now, rabbis did something really interesting with this text. So think about this mountain for a minute. It's this massive mountain in the middle of a desert. It's covered with smoke and it's fire and it's crackling with lightning and it's blaring a horn, right? And we're so scared that we're not allowed to touch it. We're not allowed to be near it. And then God says in that moment, so I've got like 613 things I need you to do. And if you do those 613 things, you'll fulfill your obligations to me, and things will be good. You'll be a treasured people. So I kind of like, it's hard to say no in that situation. In fact, rabbis understand it that way. If you look at what Rashi says here in the comment, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak says, at the bottom of the mountain, that's why I bolded it in the text. What does it mean to be at the bottom of Tachtit Hahar is what it says in Hebrew. So what does the word Tachtit mean? The word tachtit, it comes from the word tachat, right? You might know that in modern Hebrew to mean your derriere. But it also means, tachat means to be underneath. Mitachat means to be underneath. Tachat can also mean in place of the other, as if to say one king came up in place of the other. And tachtit, the tachtit of a mountain is really hard to understand. So the rabbis use this small incongruity to enter into a conversation about what was God actually expecting of the people. So take a look here at Rashi's comment. It says, at the bottom of the mountain. According to the simple rendering, it denotes at the foot of the mountain. Okay, right? If I were to say it's at the bottom of the mountain, I think you and I would know it's somewhere near the trailhead at the bottom of the mountain. But the Midrashic interpretation is that the mountain was uprooted from its place and turned over them like a beer barrel. Literally, God picked up the mountain and held it over the people and then had the conversation. So where you're not looking at the mountain this way, you're looking at the mountain this way. You're looking at the bottom of the mountain. And God says, hey, I have a proposition for you. 613 things. If you keep them, I'll put the mountain back over here. And if you don't keep them, well, I'll just let go of the mountain and we'll see what happens. So you have to understand, what's the mentality then of this picture of God, the God I know? How does we understand that this God is a God of the people, this is a God of the apocalyptic Super Bowl of theologies, right? This is a God that likes drama. This is a God that understands that a covenant means that we have an obligation to God because of what God did for us by taking us out of the land of Egypt. This is the creator of the world, the God in the white robe and the long beard, who says, I care about you and I care about the law, and this isn't quite necessarily about love and grace. This is about obligation. You owe me. As the creator of the world and the redeemer of the people, and therefore, what shall you do? I'll give you the top 10. Number 1, this is an exclusive relationship. We're not dating other people. You can't have any photographs of other gods in your wallet. That is unacceptable. Right? That's number 1. Number 2, remember what I did for you. And remember that there are certain relationships in your life that you have to hold sacred. And those relationships include me and the things that I ask you to do. Like, there's one day a week that I really like to relax. I'd like you to relax. That's our date night. I'd like you to go on a date with me once a week. And that's because I created the world and because I took you out of the land of Egypt. And you owe me that. Call your mother. Right? That's another relationship that's important. Oh, and be a good boy. Don't steal, don't lie, don't kill, and don't worry about what you have. And don't get jealous of your friend's stuff. Don't get jealous of his life, don't get jealous of his wife, don't get jealous of his donkey. Don't lie. Those are just the first 10. And those all sound pretty good. And then, there are 603 other things that you have to do, and then it becomes the relationship between the Israelites and God. The entire story of the middle section of the Tanakh is called Nevi'im, prophets. It begins with the sacred history of Israel, the rise of the kingship, the rise of the prophet class, and eventually leading all the way to the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom's destruction. The entire theology of that middle section of the book is based on one simple proposition. Did the king and the ruling class of those who lived in the land of Israel follow this covenant, or did they not follow this covenant? If they did what was not pleasing in the eyes of God, guess what happened to them? They got schmeisted, I guess you could say. The role of the prophet was always to try to adjure the people and the king to remember this covenant. Rituals, morals, legal understandings, kindness, ethics, those are all wrapped up into this singular idea that God brought us out of the land of Egypt, created the world, and we owe God for our own very existence. So here's this Mount Sinai. It's up there. It's this big, blowing up lava of a volcano hovering over us. The question is, what kind of relationship, if you were born into this world, understanding that this is what God means to you, what kind of relationship do you have with this God? How much do you value your own life? How much are you motivated to follow this God? And if you do everything that God has asked you to do to the very best of your ability, and the proverbial stuff hits the proverbial fan, that doesn't seem quite fair. And who do you end up blaming? Who do you end up blaming for why bad things happen to good people? Many of the ways when we go through the Tanakh, we see that people blame themselves. It's my fault that my husband died. It's my fault that my children were kidnapped. It's my fault that the mountain fell down and crushed the house. It's my fault because of our sins. I sinned, even if I don't know what that sin is. It's my fault. That theology begins to crack open after the destruction of the temple. We try to maintain a stream of that in rabbinic thought, but that theology begins to crack open. It's too harsh. It's too painful. The edges are too rough. Our skin can't handle that kind of harshness from God anymore. So rabbinic literature comes to the rise and says, can we come up with a system of thinking about God that's similar, that feels authentic, that feels indigenous to who we are, but softens the edges? Creates a different vision, maybe, about what God means because we're in exile. We don't have power. Our women are being raped. Our children are being taken away. We don't have money. We don't have institutions. We are degraded, despised, and living in diaspora. How do we soften our understanding of God? So take a look at what it says when it says the God of the rabbis. The place where the rabbis, more than any other in the entire Tanakh, enter into a theological conversation, the most theological book in the Tanakh, for the rabbis, is the book Song of Songs. Song of Songs is one of the last books in the Tanakh. It's in the section called Ketuvim. It is a series of poetry, pretty steamy stuff, if you ask me, of love poetry, of young lovers writing to each other about how they longed to touch and smell each other, how they were waiting impatiently to be united together. And the rabbis have this very large conversation about whether this is too hot for television and that they should excise it from the canon. Until Rabbi Akiva came along and said, actually, it's the most theological book that we have. It's not a book about how a man loves a woman or desires or lusts after a woman. And it's not a book about how a woman can't wait for a man to come into her chamber. It's a book about the love between God and the Jewish people. And they asked, when was this book written? And 4 different answers, because they can't just give one, 4 different answers were given. Well, the first was at the creation of the world. The second was at the completion of the tabernacle in the desert, in the book of Exodus and Leviticus. The third was at the splitting of the sea, and the fourth was at Mount Sinai. And they asked, those are 4 different rabbis' opinions about when this book was written, if you understand it as a theological allegory. So just take the first 4 lines of Song of Songs. It says, Shir HaShirim Ashir L'Shlomo. What a beautiful Hebrew opening, right? Shir HaShirim Ashir L'Shlomo. Imagine a poet, you're in a garden in the evening, everyone's had some wine to drink, there's a babbling brook, and a beautiful Hebrew poet gets up there and starts with Shir HaShirim Ashir L'Shlomo. It's like a beautiful evening, right? A song of songs which is Solomon's. And he says, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant, your name is oil poured out. Therefore the maidens love you. Draw me after you, we will run. The king has brought me into his chambers. We will be glad and rejoice in you. We will praise your love more than wine. Rightly they love you. So first of all, is this a male voice or a female voice? If you understand this as a heterosexual relationship, is this a male voice or a female voice? It's a female voice. It's a woman's voice. Although notice the opening line says it's written by Solomon. So this, again, the rabbis ask, what is this? If Solomon wrote it, why is he writing in a woman's voice? So it can't be just about Solomon. Shlomo doesn't mean Solomon. Shlomo is Hamelech Sheshalom Shalo, the king to whom peace belongs, which is the song of God, not the song of Solomon, in which case it doesn't matter what gender it is. Let him kiss me with the kisses of my mouth. What is that about? Very steamy stuff, right? Your love is better than wine. Think about all of these different images. Now look at what the rabbis do in the Midrash. It says, another explanation, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Rabbi Yochanan said, an angel carried the utterances at Mount Sinai from before the Holy One, Blessed One, each one in turn, and brought it to each of the Israelites. So angels coming down the mountains and said to them, do you take upon yourself this commandment? So and so many rules are attached to it. So many penalties are attached to it. So and so many precautionary measures are attached to it. So many precepts and so many lenient and strict applications are attached to it. Such and such is a reward attached to it. The Israelite would answer him and say, yes. God then said, do you accept the divinity of the Holy Blessed One? And he answered, yes, yes. What does this sound like? Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. What does this sound like? It sounds like a proposal. Look, I love you very much. Our life isn't going to be easy. We got all these things I have to do. I'm not going to make a ton of money, but I'll love you and I'll care for you if you love and care for me. What do you say? In Song of Songs, the rabbis imagined this burning mountain with its cloak of fire and smoke and lightning and the blare of the shofar. They reimagined it as a chuppah, as a wedding canopy. And where the angels come down one by one to every single Israelite who stood there and said, what do you think? Should we get hitched? And each Israelite said, yes. Thereupon it says, he kissed me with the kisses of his mouth, and hence it says, unto thee it was shown that thou might know, namely by an angelic messenger. The rabbi said, an angel isn't enough. I'll take it one step further. Each mitzvah itself went down to the Israelites and says, do you want to keep me? Do you want to protect me and follow the rules that are attached to me? Do you believe in me with all these regulations? And each one would then reply, yes, yes. And straightway the commandment kissed him on the mouth and taught him Torah. Hence it is written, lest thou forget the things which your eyes saw in Devarim, namely how the utterance spoke with thee. What's the different power dynamic? What did the rabbis just do? Is there this mountain now hanging over you, threatening you with all of your obligations, saying, you have to fulfill this obligation because I brought you to this place? You owe me? What did they just... It's amazing. They flipped the entire metaphor on its head. They created a completely different image and said, God loves you. Ahava rabbah ahavtanu. God loves us with an unending love. And God shows us that love by giving us Torah. To study it, to live by it, and to die by it. And it's not easy, but God does it in love. Therefore, because of my relationship with God, we're going to follow commandments. We're going to try to fulfill my obligations to God because God proposed marriage and I said yes. So you better believe I'm going to cook dinner on Wednesday nights when he gets home late. And you better believe I'm going to do his laundry and make sure that he has underwear in his underwear drawer. But I also know that that means that he's going to make lunches for all the kids. And I know that he's going to take them out early in the morning on Sundays to swimming lessons so I can sleep in. I have no idea what I'm talking about right now. But that's the nature of relationships. So that's another piece. Let's keep looking at a couple more, okay? Here's a story about Elijah, and those of you who were in my class earlier today heard this story already. Rabbah bar Shila once came upon Elijah the prophet, and he said, what is the Holy Blessed One doing? And Elijah replied, he's reciting the teachings that are spoken by all the rabbis except those of Rabbi Meir. And why not recite the teachings of Rabbi Meir? Asked Rabbah. Elijah said, because Rabbi Meir learned these teachings from a man named Elisha ben Abuya, the apostate who abandoned his faith. And Rabbah said, but that's not a good reason. Rabbi Meir found a pomegranate and ate the fruit and threw away the peel. Elisha ben Abuya was this famous apostate who threw away the Jewish tradition and tried to get Jews to convert out of Judaism. He walked away. His student was Rabbi Meir, one of the greatest rabbis in the Talmud. And so Elijah, who is always a stand-in for God, is teaching with his other rabbi. Elijah comes and says, well, God doesn't hold by anything that Rabbi Meir is saying because of this damaging thing that Elisha ben Abuya did. And then this rabbi is saying, well, that's not entirely true. Rabbi Meir took the peel, the bad stuff, carved it away, and the seeds that Elisha ben Abuya still has a lot of value. Pomegranate seeds are still high value, even if you don't eat the peel. His teachings are still valid, even if the vessel itself wasn't valid. It's the Torah that matters. And when they met the next time, Elijah said to Rabbah, because Elijah and Rabbah had coffee every month, right? They said to each other, when God studies the teachings of the sages, he now adds, and my son Meir says. This is also a radical shift. God changes because of what the rabbis do. And the rabbis teach God just as much as God teaches the rabbis. Okay, one more. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yossi, how do we know that the Holy One, blessed be He, says prayers? The God of the Bible doesn't really pray, but the God of the rabbis does. Because it says, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Here again, Mount Sinai being invoked, right? It is not said their prayer, but my prayer. Hence you learn that the Holy One, blessed be He, says prayers. The God has a house of prayer in which God davens, God prays. Who does God pray to? That's a good question. Who does God pray to? They don't ask that question. They ask, what does He pray? They imply who He prays to. Reb Zutra ben Tobi said in the name of Rav, may it be my will, this is what God says, may it be my will that my mercy surpasses my anger, and that my mercy may prevail over my other attributes, so that I may deal with my children in the attribute of mercy and on their behalf, and stop short of the limit of strict justice. And then it was taught, and Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha says he once actually entered the Kodesh HaKodeshim and heard God praying that prayer. That's what the rest of this text said. Questions that come out of this for me. What does God pray? Kind of know, but not exactly. Who does God pray to? Does it still explain why bad things happen to good people? This is a different way of approaching God. This makes sense if you're in exile, that you need a God that has a softer touch. That God loves us, God is with us, even in our deepest, darkest moments. Okay, I get that. But does it solve the problem of why bad things happen to good people? Does it solve the problem of human suffering? And then what happens, which is the ultimate question, what happens when you're ready to break this image of God and say, if I can't prove God exists, why do I believe in these stories, these myths? If God isn't an angel in a white robe up in heaven, does any of this, whether it's as a lover or as a king and a commander, make any difference? Can I believe in this God, or am I just imagining it? Those are questions that will be taken up after the break in just a few minutes. But for now, I want to leave you with this. There's the last text here. This is a Targum of Song of Songs. A Targum is an Aramaic translation. I just found this earlier today. The translation in English might not be great because I was translating it myself, so please excuse that. But here's an Aramaic Targum of Song of Songs, chapter 5, where the writer of the Targum tried to encapsulate what he believed was the God of Israel. He said, then the assembly of Israel began to speak in praise of the Lord of the world, and what is said, the God I desire to worship is the one who by day is dressed in a robe as white as snow, and is occupied with the 24 books of the law, the words of the prophets, the writings, and who by night is occupied by the 6 orders of the Mishnah, and the glorious splendor of his face blazes like a fire from the intense wisdom and judgment, for he innovates new traditions every day and will reveal them alongside his people on the great day, that is to say at the end of time. And his banner is over a myriad of myriads of angels who minister before him. His law is more desirable than pure gold, and the interpretation of its words contain heaps upon heaps of reasons and precepts. They are white as snow to those who keep them, but black as a raven's wing to those who do not keep them. His eyes are looking constantly at Jerusalem to do good to her and to bless her from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, like doves that stand and look at the streams of water. Because of the merit of those who sit on the Sanhedrin, occupied with the law, making justice flow down smoothly like milk, and those who sit in the house of study and take great care in judgment until they determine to acquit or to condemn. This is a God who is mystical and beautiful and pure and holy and loves more than anything else, loves the law. And that teaching and ruminating on the law and creating traditions and fences around the law is what God's actions in the world do and does for us. These are the images of the biblical God who seems much more primitive and the intellectual God of the rabbis. The biblical God who is the God of the mountain, the warrior God of the mountain with the big Super Bowl fireworks, and the God of the rabbis who is the librarian, the scholar in the house study, and the judge over the people. Think about the questions about what you'd want to talk. If you were to talk to either of these gods, these versions of God, what would you ask them? What would you want to know? What more could you ask of them or about them? And how would these images of God affect your life? And then ask yourself this, as you prepare yourself for going to break and come back with Rabbi Feinstein, why was this God not enough for the philosophers and for the mystics? What is the human need that the philosophers and the mystics are trying to answer that these images of God don't answer? I'll see you after the break.
So, young man, a mother calls me hysterical. You've got to speak to my kid. Sure, what's the problem? His bar mitzvah is coming up, and he doesn't believe in God. Really? Bring him in. So the mother, hysterical, because how can he have a bar mitzvah? He doesn't believe in God. Can you imagine such a thing, a Jewish child who doesn't believe in God? Rabbi, what are you going to do? Fix him. Okay, fine, I'll fix him. The kid comes in, a perfectly nice kid, by the way. He sits in front of me. I said, what's the problem? He says, my mom. I said, yeah, well, welcome to the... I said, of course. But what's your mom? What's your problem with your mom? He says, well, I was talking and I told my mom I don't believe in God anymore. I said, oh, you don't believe in God anymore? He says, yeah. Are you surprised? Now, I have a choice at this point because I have a real temptation to go, oh, you're the only one. Not since Benedict Spinoza has anyone asked that question. He says, I'm 13 years old, I don't believe in God. My bar mitzvah's coming up. So I said, well, tell you what, let me ask you a question. He said, sure. I said, what do you mean by God? He says, what do you mean by God? You're a rabbi, you know what God is. I said, I actually don't. That word, God, can be defined in many, many different ways. People have many, many different understandings of who God is, what it means to live with God. Who is this God you don't believe in? And he's frustrated with me. He says, come on, Rabbi. You know, God. You know, a spirit in the sky who rewards good people and punishes evil people. I said, oh, that's not God. That's Santa Claus. I have trouble with that one too. He said, really? But you're a rabbi. Translation, you have to believe in this stuff. We pay you to believe in this stuff. I said, but you got to believe in what you believe in. You see, the question is, when you say the word God, what do you mean? And what Rabbi Farkas has shown us is that even if you start from the very beginning, if you open the Bible, the God that you meet in chapter 1 of Genesis is very different than the God that you meet in chapter 2 of Genesis. Even within the Bible itself, even within the same book of the Bible itself, you find very different ideas of God. Very different ideas of who God is, what God does, how God behaves, and what it means to believe in God, to attach yourself to God. And what difference does it make in your life? And then beyond that, what he showed us was that under the influence of events, catastrophic events that have shaped Jewish history, people have radically changed their ideas of God. The idea of God that a biblical Jew could hold. The idea of God, for example, that we meet in the Pesach Haggadah, in the Passover story. You know, the Charlton Heston God. You know what I'm talking about? 10 mighty plagues from heaven. By the time of the rabbis, who witnessed the destruction of the temple, the burning of Jerusalem, the murder of the priests by the hands of the Roman Empire, they couldn't believe in that God anymore. If they had believed in that God, the catastrophe of the destruction of Jerusalem would have destroyed their faith. They all would have gone off and become Romans. They had to think of a different idea of how God plays a role in my life if God isn't going to send plagues to destroy Rome. So catastrophic events change the way that we look at the universe, change the way that we look at God. and you create a whole different way. The other thing that he pointed out, and I wanted you to pay attention to this before we move forward, is the literature. The kind of literature we just read with the rabbi. Did you notice something about all that literature? It's not philosophical. Well, it's philosophical in the sense that it deals with big ideas, but the idiom, the manner of expression is not philosophical. The manner of expression is storytelling. Now, what's the difference between telling you a truth in the form of a discursive philosophical argument and telling you a truth in the form of a story? How does the story form of a truth change the way that the truth is presented? This is one of the things I want to point out. He talked to us about the destruction of the temple and how it changed the way that the rabbis understood God, even though they revered the God that was presented in the Bible. Now I want to move forward in history a little bit. Following the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, we have some generations of Jews who remained in Israel, remained in Eretz Yisrael, but the bulk of the Jewish community moves eastward into what is today Iraq, then we called it Babylon, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and that's the place in which the Talmud grows. And then when that civilization, the great Saracenian Empire of Iraq falls apart, and that part of the world becomes unstable, Jews begin to move eastward again, across North Africa, and they make their domicile in communities across North Africa with a center in Spain. And Spain now rises, as the Muslims conquer Spain in the 7th century, Spain rises as a place of Jewish civilization. And for the very first time in history, under the Muslim rulers, something happens in Spanish Jewish civilization which never happened before. A real, honest, open conversation with other religious traditions. In Babylon, that never happened. There were business relationships between Jews and non-Jews. But there really wasn't a real conversation among traditions. We kept to ourselves when we talked about religion. In Israel, in Canaan, in Palestine, that never happened. But in Spain, you have for the very first time something that never happened before. Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others are having serious conversation about what do you believe. And for the first time, Judaism has to defend its truth in a marketplace of ideas. And when the community begins to perceive that its best and brightest are leaving because other traditions are more compelling, the community needs to respond. And the warrior who rose up, an intellectual warrior who rose up to fight that battle, is Moses Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, physician, and rabbi of the 12th century. Maimonides is born in Cordova, raised there till he's 13. His father is a dayan, his father's a great scholar. And then because life becomes unstable in Spain, they move across North Africa to Fez, where he gains his medical education. And then from Fez, he ends up in Cairo, in the suburbs of Cairo. And there he's going to write several important books, 2 monumental books. Early in his life, he writes Mishnah Torah, the great code of Jewish law, which begins with a section that no one else had ever thought of before. The first section of Mishnah Torah, the Maimonides' code of Jewish law, is Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah, the laws that provide the foundations of the Torah. Maimonides says, before you can do Judaism, you have to believe Judaism. And he begins by laying out, here's what you have to believe. And then later in his life, he writes the greatest book of Jewish philosophy ever written, which is called The Guide for the Perplexed. It's actually a letter to his student who came and had to leave in the middle of his training. And this is the guide, this is the philosophical text that's going to guide his student toward the completion of his training. Now, what is Maimonides' agenda? What is the truth of Judaism? And how do I defend the truth of Judaism now that Judaism has to put up a defense in the face of all these intellectual challenges? So the first thing that he does is choose a language. In what language do I need to mount this defense? I'm going to use the language of philosophy, which is not a Jewish language. As you saw, the Bible and the Midrash is written in mythic language, in story language. But Maimonides is going to use philosophy because philosophy is the common ground between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We all speak philosophy, and therefore we can defend our faith in the words of philosophy. And that's going to be his idiom. And what is the tool of proving this? Well, the one thing that we all have in common is reason. Can I use the tool of reason in the idiom of philosophy to prove the truth claims of the Jewish tradition? And when you apply reason, pure reason, to the question of who is God, well, you end up with a very different God than the God that Rabbi Farkas showed us appears in the Bible and in the Talmud. So I brought you a little bit of Rambam today. Rambam is Maimonides' nickname. Ready? So this is the first section of the Guide for the Perplexed. Now, by the way, if you're perplexed, don't go off and buy this book. For a very simple reason. If you start out perplexed, the Guide for the Perplexed will make you even more perplexed. That's the thesis of a wonderful new biography of Rambam by a friend of mine. And he writes at the end of the book, he says, he called it Guide to the Perplexed, not because it takes you out of your perplexity, because it takes you into your perplexity. Only a Jew would write such a book, right? So here's what he's doing. Maimonides says, before we can figure out what we can believe, we better get the language straight. And so the first third of the Guide for the Perplexed is a glossary, a dictionary of words we find in the Bible that might mislead us to think the wrong thing. And the very first word he takes up is a word that we read just last week in the Torah portion. In the first chapter of Genesis, in the 26th verse, God says, Naseh et Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. And Rambam said, Maimonides says, what do you mean by that? And so he writes as follows. People have thought that in the Hebrew language, the word image, tselem, denotes the shape and configuration of a thing. This supposition led them to the doctrine of the corporeality of God. I'll explain that. On account of his saying, let us make man in our image after our likeness. For they thought that God has a man's form, his shape and configuration. The doctrine of the corporeality of God was a necessary conclusion. People read that line and said, let us make man in our image and our likeness. They said, well, look, okay, so if I have 2 arms, God must have 2 arms. If I have 2 legs, God must have 2 legs, right? If I have a nose, God must have a nose. God must be like me, a body in space. Because it says, make man in our image. This must be the image of God. And by the way, all the people who said that were male. So God is a man. That's obvious, right? Okay, I used to live in Texas, so did Rabbi Farkas. And we'll tell you that down in Texas, they really do believe that God has a 10-gallon hat, drives a pickup truck, and owns a gun, right? Because it's God's constitutional right. Because that's what, that's how God operates. But see, Maimonides says, this is what the Bible says, right? They accordingly believed in it and deemed that if they abandoned this belief, they would give the lie to the biblical text, and that they would even make the deity nothing at all, unless they thought that God was a body with a face and hands like them in shape and configuration. And if you said to them, but no. If you said to them, when the Bible says that God created man in his image, that's not literally true. That's a metaphor. That's what most of us would say, right? If a child asks you that question, that's what you would say. It's a metaphor. But these people say, hang on a second. If you're going to tell me that's a metaphor, what can I believe in the Bible? What in the Bible is true and what in the Bible is metaphor? And they said, if I start turning everything into a metaphor, then there's no Bible left. There's no Bible left. I have to believe in this. I have to believe in this. However, God, in their view, is bigger and more resplendent than they themselves in a manner of which he's composed not of flesh and blood. As they see it, this is as far as one can go in establishing the separateness of God from other beings. Now, with respect to that which ought to be said in order to refute the doctrine of the corporeality means God has a body, okay? And to establish his real unity, which can have no true reality unless one disproves his corporeality, you should know the demonstration of all this from the treatise. He talked about that later. However, here in this chapter, only an indication is given with view to elucidating the meaning of image and likeness. Here's Maimonides' problem. If you say that God has a body, then God can be split in half. And if God is split in half, he's no longer one. If you say that God has a body, in order to be a body, there has to be a boundary of a body, right? My body has a boundary. Now, it's an ever-expanding boundary, that's true, but it's a boundary, which means that there's the body and then there's what's outside the body. Are you willing to say that there's stuff outside of God? Maimonides says it is logically impossible to believe that God has a body, but people don't care. It says so in the Bible. And if it says so in the Bible, it's got to be true. So the first question is a question of methodology. Who do you believe? Remember Groucho Marx used to say, who do you believe, me or your own lying eyes, you know? Who do you believe, what the Bible says or what your logic tells you? How do I square, how do I reconcile what I know logically to be true with what it says in the Bible? That's the problem he's dealing with, but there's a bigger problem he's dealing with. And you can hear it, and with Maimonides you have to listen to what he doesn't say. It's between the lines. It's not just a question of saying, God looks like me, with 2 hands and 2 arms and 2 legs and a nose. It's bigger than that. We always imagine God to be like us. We project our own being onto God. We project our prejudices onto God. We project our desires onto God. We project our nationalism and our chauvinism onto God. We project our sense of right and wrong onto God. We always project ourselves onto God. Now, that's understandable. What other language can you possibly use to describe something except the language you know? And we do this all the time, by the way. It's not just God that we project, right? Americans spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on pet food, even though there are hungry people in our own society, because we project our own selves onto our dogs. Oh, little Bougie, here's a steak. You know, as I told you, if God ever gives you a chance, when you come back as an Encino Jewish dog. No better life. But we project our own humanity onto the dog, and we imagine that the dog won't eat dog food. I better give him real food. We do that. We project it onto our cars. We give our cars names. We talk to them. No, be nice to me. Get me to work, right? But when it comes to God, it's even more so. We project ourselves onto God. And when you project yourself onto God, what do? You then say, well, God's an American. Everybody knows God's an American. God's on our side. God loves what we do. God's a Democrat. God's a Republican. Right? We project ourselves onto God, and then we make God the astral reflection of our own being. There's a name for that. That's called idolatry. Because when you project yourself onto God, what you're saying is, the universe endorses what I am. And that, says Maimonides, is idolatry. That's the real problem. So how are we going to solve this problem? Anytime you project yourself onto God and say, that's what God is, you have violated God's being. But now you say, hang on a minute, Rabbi. If you're telling me that I can't project myself onto God in any way, what can I say about God? I can't say that God speaks. That's a human thing. I can't say that God knows. That's a human thing. I can't say that God wills or desires or commands. That's a human thing. Pretty soon you run out of words to describe God. And says Maimonides, precisely. What do you end up with? A God you can't say anything about. Why not? Because God is totally other than human. Totally other than human. And really, you can't say anything about that God. You really can't say anything about that God at all. So let's go a little farther. The term image is applied to the nature of a thing. The way a thing is constituted as a substance becomes what it is. So the term image, tselem, does not mean the way something looks. It means the essence of it. What's the essence of it? It's what makes it and not something else. Look at the chair you're sitting on. What makes it a chair and not a table? So Maimonides, like all medieval philosophers, thought that that object has a quality called chairness. And it has sufficient amount of chairness in it not to be a table. And if it didn't have so much chairness, it would turn into a table or a pussycat or something else. But it has chairness in it. God and human beings share a ness, an essence. And what is that essence, he says? Listen carefully. That which is meant by this in the scriptural dictum, let us make man in our image, was the specific form, which is intellectual capacity, not shape and configuration. What is it that we share with God? The one thing you can say about God, says Maimonides, is that God thinks. And the one thing that you know human beings do is think. And when you think, and when you think clearly, without prejudice, without letting your own ego get in the way, without rationalizing your own bad behavior or bad desires, you are actually thinking the thoughts of God. You connect with God in thought, in reasoning. Now, figure out how that's going to work. Then what does it mean to be a prophet? It means a prophet is a person who has so perfected himself or herself as to clean themselves of all prejudice, to think pure, rational thoughts, which are the thoughts of God. And who is the greatest prophet who ever lived? Is Moses, who cleansed himself of all of the ego and thought God's thoughts and then wrote them down for us, but wrote them down for us in a language that you and I, who are not as pure as him, could understand. And that's how Maimonides constructs Judaism. A God who is pure thought. A pure thought God. Not commanding, not loving, not angry, none of that stuff. None of it. What is God? Thought. That's all that God does in the world, is think. But you can connect with those thoughts. So here is Maimonides' answer to the question, who is God? Early in his life, he wrote a commentary to the Mishnah, which is the great book of Jewish law. And the 10th chapter of Talmud Sanhedrin, we have a section called Chelek. Who gets into heaven? That's the question in the Talmud. And Maimonides writes a commentary on that. And in it, he puts something which no one had ever done before. He says, all right, let me give this to you straight. There are 13 things you got to believe. No one had ever done that before, by the way. And since, by the way, no one's done it as well as him. A recipe. 13 things a Jew has to believe. I gave you the first 3. You'll have to figure out the rest yourself. Ready? Number 1, to believe in the existence of the Creator. Now, wait a minute. Creator, you said, Rabbi, creating is something human beings do. How did God create? Well, it's not exactly that way. God is. And because God is, everything else can be. God is the first cause of all being, the originator of all that is. To believe in the existence of the Creator, that there is an existent, with a capital E, complete in all senses the word existence. He is the cause of all existence. In him all else subsists, and from him derives. It is inconceivable that he not exist, for should he not exist, the existence of all else would be extinguished, and nothing could persist. Now, right about now, you're saying, bring back Farkas and that wonderful language about kissing my mouth and loving me and the chuppah over the head and the mountain. Where is that beautiful mythic language of the rabbis? And you're exactly right. He knows he's writing a language which is foreign to us. And that's exactly what he wants you to hear, the foreignness of that language. Because what is he saying? Take away all of your projections. What are you left with? A pure rational idea of a God of existence and a God of rationality. And that's Maimonides' God. We're going to stop here with this. I'll take a question. But I just want you to hear this one thing. What Maimonides tells us over and over again is be very careful that when you're talking about God, you're not projecting into the sky what you want God to be. You're actually perceiving what's reasonable, what's reasoned, what's real. Yes, Bobby. Most people thought Maimonides was not so cool, so you're a very small minority of people. It doesn't seem Jewish. Well, first of all, he didn't get away with it because they burned his books, right? Maimonides was the most hated Jewish philosopher in Jewish history and also the greatest, okay? Because, for a number of reasons. One is because he was also the greatest rabbi in the history of the rabbinic tradition, the greatest rabbi who ever lived. And his code of Jewish law is still the code of Jewish law that everybody uses, right? Because he knew that, and look what he does. So let's go back to the piece we learned a minute ago, okay? Right? Look at the first fundamental principle. Just look what he says, right? Right, just as I'll pick it up where I left off, right? If we imagine the absence of any other existent thing, however, God's existence would not thereby be extinguished nor diminished, for unity and mastery are only God's, since God is sufficient unto himself. All else, whether angel or celestial, whatever is in them or below them, needs him to exist. The first fundamental principle is taught in the biblical verse, I am the Lord your God, Ani Adonai Elohechem. He claimed that what he was doing was midrash. He was telling you what Moses meant by the first commandment. When the first commandment is Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am the Lord your God. Right? Maimonides said, what did Moses mean by that? And he's telling you, and he connects it back to the biblical verse. He believes that's what Moses was saying. He believes that's what Moses is saying. And his big crusade, and I want to say this again because I think it's terribly important, and if you picked up the morning newspaper, this is still terribly important. Rabbi Schulweis used to say that the world hasn't yet caught up with Maimonides. People are still projecting themselves onto God. If I believe God hates people like you, because I hate people like you, I have full license to go and try to destroy you. We still are, and Maimonides said that is the great sin of idolatry. Nobody worships rocks and trees. No one ever worshipped rocks and trees. We worship the ego. And what is the ego? God's like me. God likes the things I like. God likes the people I like. God has values like mine. I know that my values are real because God likes my values. Right? There's a church in Nazareth. It's a good place to go visit, by the way. It's the Church of the Nativity in Nazareth, Israel. And what they did is a beautiful thing, brilliant thing. They went around the world and asked Christian artists from all over the world to paint a picture of Jesus. Now, Jesus is even God. Jesus is a person, right? And guess what? And they put them all up on the wall of this church. It's a huge church, and there must be 50 of these giant portraits of Jesus. The artists in Africa painted Jesus black. The artists in Asia painted Jesus Asian. The artists in Aboriginal Australia painted him Aborigine. The artists in Scandinavia painted him Norwegian with blue eyes, right? It's a brilliant image because we project ourselves onto God. And Maimonides says that's idolatry. That's idolatry. Now this notion of what role and we're going to need this equipment as we welcome each of our scholars to visit us. What role does reason play in religion? What role does the questioning mind, the skepticism and doubt play in religion? And Maimonides says it's the governor to make sure that I'm not worshiping myself, which is the ultimate form of idolatry. Okay, I got a lot more to teach, so Pop, give it a short question.
Yeah, so then according to Maimonides, you're not allowed to say, where was God during the Holocaust, and why did God allow it?
Yes, because it's not that you're not allowed. Of course you can say that. But his answer is going to be, God was all around all the time. Why didn't you pay attention? Right? That's what he's going to do. And he's going to say to you, what is the Holocaust? It's the same thing as you see in the morning paper. People who worship their own prejudices, their own hatreds. That's the easiest thing. God hates the people I hate. Right? And that becomes a very serious issue. Okay, I'm going to get a couple more quick questions, but I really got to get back to the text because I got to do mysticism, and that's a whole nother. Yes, please.
If God is pure thought, isn't that a projection of people?
Yes, but that's just the least he could do because he understood that was the least you could say about God. God thinks, and when you think, clearly you're connecting to God. He had this idea that intellect is a radio station. You ever get an idea and you say to yourself, where the hell did that idea come from? You ever have an intuition, a hunch, a sense, and it turned out to be right? And you say, where did it come from? Maimonides has an answer for that. God is a radio station broadcasting truth into the world. Right? KGOD. The problem is, most of us have too much static on our radio because right next to it is all these other stations advertising all kinds of crap. And the problem is we don't listen. But if you could cleanse your mind of prejudice, cleanse your mind of rationalization, cleanse your body of desires and distractions. One of the problems is the body. As soon as you start thinking clearly, your nose itches. And you smell apple pie in the next room. And you say, I should go exercise. No, I should go to Costco. No, I should watch television. And then pretty soon, imagination, bodily desires, the itchy nose, done. No more thinking. KGOD, broadcasting and no one listening. But when you get a hunch, he said, that's called the active intellect. You are connecting to this divinity, the divine intelligence that fills the world. You see how that works? Someone had a question. Yes, we're going to do the last one, then I'm going to do mysticism. Wait one second.
Wondering,
Yes.
it sounds almost like if you're like Buddhist. You
I
know,
can't, sorry, what?
like you're a Buddhist. Where
I'm
you
a
don't-
Buddhist?
No, I'm saying what Maimonides is
It
saying.
would be
that
funny
it's
if I
like
were a
everything
Buddhist.
is intellectual, then there can't.
That's not
really-
Buddhism. Buddhism actually doesn't have an idea of, Buddhism typically doesn't believe in a God.
That's what I mean. That's
But
what
it
I'm
has a
saying.
different sense of the universe, and sometimes
Right.
great traditions meet at those points.
Yeah.
You're
that's-
right.
Yeah.
Okay, turn the page over. Real quick. I got to get to the next page. Yeah. It's not cosmic consciousness because, well, it's a long story, why not? But let's wait and we'll come back to that, okay? Okay, now, Maimonides offers this super rational God. He strips away all of Rabbi Farkas's beautiful stories. No more kissing lips, no more chuppah held aloft, no more loving God, no more commanding God, no more angry God, just thought. And guess what happens? Well, we get thrown out of Spain, right? First of all, there's the Reconquista. The Christians start reinvading Spain. And as the Christians are invading Spain, are moving through Spain and pressing on the Jewish community, and Jewish life becomes terribly precarious. And eventually in 1492, we get tossed out of Spain. Jewish life changes. And the Jewish community needs something more personal, intimate, emotional, close than the rational purity of Maimonides. And comes roaring back, as it happens in history, a great wave of a different religious tradition, the wave of mysticism. Quick definition. Mysticism exists in every religion in the world. Mysticism is a form of religion in which the seeker wants to have a personal experience of God. 3 words. 1, personal. Mysticism goes around organized traditions and says, traditions are fine for the rest of you guys. But I want the shortcut right to God's presence. I want the shortcut. Give me the shortcut. So mysticism is usually taught in small circles of small, deeply disciplined scholars. Number 2, it's not a question of believing in God, knowing about God, learning all about God. The mystic wants to stand face to face with God. He wants to shake God's hand, as it were. Wants to know God as a personal experience. And God, The God of the mystic is a very different God than the God of Maimonides. Judaism, every tradition has mystics. There's Christian mysticism, Muslim mysticism, Sufism, Buddhist mysticism, Hindu mysticism, and Jewish mysticism. The interesting thing about Jewish mysticism is that unlike all the other traditions, the mainstream normative tradition of Judaism never felt threatened by the mystics. They argued with the mystics. Sometimes they banished the mystics, but they never tried to destroy mysticism. In fact, what happened is that very often the leaders of the normative tradition were also mystics. Best example, a man named Yosef Karo. Rabbi Joseph Karo, who lives in Tzfat in the north of Israel in the 16th century. By day, he's the greatest Jewish lawyer ever, even greater than Maimonides. He's the writer of the Shulchan Aruch, the greatest Jewish code of law. By night, an angel came to him and took him on a tour of the heavens. Schizophrenic? Yes. Welcome to the Jewish people. This is what happens when you experience radical trauma. And it's the same guy. Rational, legal genius by day, lunatic mystic by night. Right? And that's what happened in our tradition. And the reason why is because unlike Christianity or Islam, you don't have to be a believer in a certain doctrine in order to join the Jewish people. We are a community that transcends doctrinal differences, so we were never threatened by the mystics. And we could allow mystics to live among us and share the life of the community with us. Who was the God that the mystics came across? Well, one of the first great Spanish mystics who finds his home in Tzfat in 1492, Ferdinand marries Isabel. We made the shidduch, by the way. Don Isaac Abarvanel arranged the ksuba and the ketubah, and the shidduch was that as soon as Isabel and Ferdinand got married, as a wedding present, they kicked the Jews out of the country and stole all their property. Siman Tov and Mazel Tov, right? Where did Jews go? Some went to Portugal, some went to Italy, some went to Holland, many went to North Africa, and a small circle, including all the mystics, ended up in northern Israel in a small town called Tzfat. Anyone ever been there? It's a beautiful little town. Clear mountain air, right? Hillside. It's really, if you want to be a mystic, this is a good place to be a mystic. And one of the great teachers of the Tzfat tradition is Moshe Cordovero. Moshe Cordovero. Now you know Moshe Cordovero. You just don't know you know Moshe Cordovero. Moshe Cordovero is the teacher of Yehuda Alkabetz, who is the writer of Lecha Dodi. Lecha Dodi likrat kala. Penei Shabbat Nikah is a very mystical, sexy poem that was written by his student. Cordovero writes beautiful mystical texts. Listen to what he writes. This is really going to blow your mind. Ready? The essence of divinity, divinity is God, is found in every single thing. Nothing but it exists. What? Let me do that again. We usually think of God as other. We're here, God's there. God is commanding us. God took us out of Egypt. God and us, we're different. Maimonides makes a huge philosophy out of how different God is from us. Cordovero comes along having experienced the trauma of the destruction of Spanish Jewry, and what does he say? Nope. The farther you go into a mystic experience, and this is your Buddhist theme again, the more you discover that it's all one. It's not that God is up and we are down. God is other and we are human. It's all God. I'll give you the exercise I taught my children. Ready? Imagine standing in front of a big full-length mirror. Right? Here's your head. Here's your arms. Here's your tummy. Here's your tush. Here's your knees. Here's your feet. There you are. I say to you, now show me where your self is. Self? Yes, self. Show me where your self is. Well, you know, self. Self is the part of you that makes you you. It's the part of you that thinks and remembers and laughs and cries and guides everything. Self is the part of you that's you. If I chopped off your arms, would you still be you? You'd be armless, but you'd be you. If I chopped off your legs, would you still be you? Yep. If I cut off your hair, would you still be you? Yeah. What if I cut off everything but your head and it kept you alive? Would you still be you? You'd be a strange you, but you'd be a you. Why? Because you'd still be a self. Where's your self? Here's the exercise. Ready? Imagine the whole universe is a body, and God is the self of the universe. Which makes you and me what? Cells in the body of God. Now, if we are cells in the body of God, we are all connected to each other, right? I mean, it's easy to imagine that your foot and your... Look how far apart my foot and my finger are. But they're still part of the same thing, right? If you don't believe me, hit your foot with a hammer and see how your finger feels about it. Right? We are all cells in the body of God. Our individuation, our sense that I am me and you are you and we are separate is an illusion. The reality is, you and me were part of the same being, the same flow of reality. On a higher or deeper level, whichever metaphor you like, it is all one. Everything on the planet, everything in the universe, everything that is one. Shema Yisrael, listen up, Jews. Adonai Eloheinu, God is all of it. Adonai Echad, it's all one. And if you ever forget that, go upstairs. There's a beautiful window that says that. And opposite that window is another window, which says, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your neighbor, not as yourself, who is yourself. Because if it's all one, your pain is my pain. And your joy is my joy. And your peace is my peace. But your conflict is my conflict. It's all one. This is Cordevero's mystical idea. Ready? The essence of divinity is found in every single thing. Everything is divine. Now, by the way, if everything is divine, I want to listen to God. I don't necessarily have to go listen to the Torah. A bird can tell me. Right? A chipmunk can tell me. I don't have to. There's a lot of places to go hear God's voice. Torah might be the easiest place to go hear it, but there's a lot of places to go. Since it causes everything to be, nothing can live by anything else. It enlivens then, existence exists in each existent. Do not attribute duality to God. What is duality? God there, us here. God up, us down. God other? No. Let God be God. If you suppose that Ein Sof, that's the name for God, emanates to a certain point, and from that point on it's outside of it, you've dualized. Any place you say, Reseda, that's not God. Or Afghanistan is not God. Or people who aren't Jewish are not God. No. That's dualism. That you can't, God forbid. Realize rather that Ein Sof exists in every existent. Do not say, this is a stone and not God. God forbid. Rather, all existence is God, and the stone is a thing pervaded by divinity. Now, you advance a couple of centuries, and you get to the Gera Rebbe, who grows up in a Warsaw suburb at the end of the 19th century and takes over the leadership of one of the great Hasidic communities at the beginning of the 20th century. Just the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And he writes a letter one Pesach to his children, which we intercepted and translated for you. Most people do not understand how to leap up and attach themselves to God. The word Pesach literally means leap up. It doesn't mean pass over. It means jump up. Okay? Yes. I shall reveal to you what I know about it in a forthright manner, which is unusual for rabbis, because if we were forthright, we would be much briefer, right? The proclamation of oneness that we declare every day in saying, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is God, Adonai is one, really needs to be understood as it truly is. The meaning of Adonai is one is not that he is the only God negating other gods, though this too is true. But the meaning is deeper than that. There is nothing else but God. There's nothing else but God. This is true even though it seems otherwise to most people who understand such things for their countless feelings about this matter. Right? There's nothing else but God. Right? Ki hu Adonai Eloheinu b'shamayim mimal v'ala aretz mitachat ein od. V'ha'aretz mitachat ein od. God is one in heaven, and on the ground, on the earth below, there's nothing else. Ein od. There's nothing else but God. It's all God. If it's all God and we are cells in the body of God, now play that one out. When I pray, what am I doing? In a certain way, yes. When I pray, what I'm trying to do is to erase the illusion that I am individual, separate, alone, and try to regain a sense of my unity with the all. Prayer is a mystical experience of allness, of becoming one with the all. And if I pray really well, when I finish my prayer and I finish, what do I know? That you and I belong to each other. That I am responsible to you. There's an ethical imperative that comes from that. Let's turn it the other way around. And what do you call the person who decides he's going to go it alone? Well, let's try that in biology. What do you call the cell in your body that decides it's going to go its own? There's a cell in your liver, a cell in your lungs, a cell in your breast, a cell in your prostate, and it decides, to hell with the rest of you, I'm having a zillion children. You call that cancer. Evil is a cancer in the body of God. Evil is the cell that forgot. It is responsible to the all and for the all. Right? And sometimes it can be ameliorated, and sometimes it just has to be destroyed. It's a really interesting philosophy. This is called, there's two names for this. It's either called pantheism, in which you say the all is God, or if you say the all is God, but there's more to God than just the all, that's called panentheism. Okay? So listen a little farther. Ready? There's nothing else but God. Everything that exists in the world, spiritual and physical, is God himself. It is only because of the contraction that God's will, blessed be he in his name, that holiness descended rung after rung until physical things were formed of it. These things are true without doubt. So there's a process that the mystics understood. How come, if God is so ethereal, we end up with physical matter? And it was called Tzimtzum. We'll come back to that another time. Because of this, every person can attach himself to God wherever he is, through the holiness that exists within every single thing, even corporeal things. This is classic Hasidism. The Hasid said, and I know that today Hasidism looks very different than this, but the Hasid says, anybody can attach himself to God at any moment. All he has to do is change his mind. The problem, that when you say God is far away and I don't think God hears my prayers, that problem is not a metaphysical problem. God is far away. That's a psychological problem. That's a psychological problem. He has a beautiful saying. He says, imagine this Jew reciting the Shema Yisrael with such kavanah, such passion, right? And he's screaming at the top of his voice. Sometimes you get to it over from shul, you'll see this guy screaming, Shema Yisrael Ad Hashem Elokeinu, right? And God is standing right next to him going, I'm right here. Because the next line in the end of the Shema is Ani Adonai Elohechem. I am the Lord your God. It's like God is saying, you don't have to shout. Boychik, I'm right here. But you're so intent on shouting that you forgot that the God you were shouting to is right here. You don't have to shout. And if God is right next to you at all moments, if God is available to you in all things, then all it does is take a change of your heart, change of your mind in order to see that. It's a change of consciousness. Not a problem of metaphysics. Not a problem of how the universe is structured. And if that's the case, says the Chassid, stop being so sad. You Jews, you're always worried. You're so worried. You're worried about Israel. You're worried about America. You're worried about the Obama administration. You're worried about racism. You're worried about guns. You're worried about assimilation and intermarriage and the disappearance of the Jewish people. You're worried. Enough. You know what's keeping you from knowing God is close? Your worry. Worry ultimately is worship of the ego. It's a very self-absorbed state to walk around depressed all the time. You know anybody who's really depressed? And they walk around all the time going, I'm so depressed. I'm so depressed. You say, all right, so be depressed, but go in your own room and be depressed. Like, why do you have to schlep me into it? It's a very self-absorbed thing. The Chassid says, let go of that self-absorption and be happy. God's right next to you. What do you want? That's what he says. That's why Hasidism sponsored joy as a Jewish mode of worship. That's why they dance so much, right? Because of this, every person can attach himself to God wherever he is through the holiness that exists within every single thing, even corporeal things. You only have to be negated in the sparks of holiness. You have to negate the ego, the me voice inside of your head. In this way, you truly bring about ascents to the upper world, causing true pleasure to God. A person in such a state lacks for nothing. He can attach himself to God wherever place he is. This is the foundation of all mystical formulations in the world. He's right about that. Every person can attach himself to the holiness within his own limbs, physical and spiritual, going very high, truly to God. The essential task of worship is opening this point. So the mystic, when he achieves his personal experience of God, discovers what? God is not far away. God is the all. And by opening my mind to that idea, I feel like I can experience God in all things and in all moments. Now look how far we've come from Rabbi Farkas's mountain on top of us, right? And each of these are very legitimate, very kosher, very traditional ideas about God. For the next 15, 16 weeks, we're going to explore all these ideas together. You have a homework assignment. We've heard from the Rebbe. We've heard from the Rambam. We've heard from the rabbis of the Talmud. We've heard from the Bible. Now we want to hear from you. And what are your ideas about God? We'll see you next week. Rabbi Artson will be our guest.